Hello, this is Willard Watson, Programs and Outreach Director at the Blowing Rock Art and History Museum. And today I'm going to share with you an interview that I did with artists Roger Atkins, Jim Oleson, and Anthony Ulinski in September of 2020. These three gentlemen were presenting artists in our exhibition Branching Out Works in Wood from North Carolina. In the following interview, we discuss their influences, inspirations, and techniques. Roger Atkins, from his artist statement, working with wood has been a passion nearly all of Roger's life. At the age of 9, he recalls being in his grandfather's dirt floor garage workshop in Harlan, Kentucky. And this was a shop filled with the aromas of coal dust, oil, and wood, as Roger's mother's father would be working with his simple hand tools, fashioning something needed for the family's very modest home. Roger followed this passion into college, where he studied art at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. It was there that he began to investigate the beauty and elasticity of wood as a sculptural medium. Roger's work focuses on a conversation between form and mathematics. Sometimes he will consider a mathematical formula and what his resulting form will be. With other work, he considers form and what mathematics have been applied to make it a reality. Jim Oleson, from Jim's artist statement, quote, "I have been making furniture for about 35 years. Early projects were utilitarian, but as I continued to design and make furniture, my vision began to change. I imagined objects composed of related shapes, lines, and curves, sculptural objects that embodied aesthetic ideas. I've transitioned from making functional objects to making small-scale, abstract sculpture. I found that making furniture had become less challenging as I mastered the techniques. My inspiration for abstract design is primarily from nature, where many curved shapes arise from differential growth and are described by relatively simple mathematical formulae." End quote. Oleson is a sculptor who resides in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics and Physics at St. Olaf College, and a PhD in Physics from the Johns Hopkins University, and a medical doctorate from the University of Arizona. He was a research physicist and subsequently a physician on the faculties of the University of Arizona, Duke University, and Harvard University. Anthony Ulinski, from Anthony's artist statement, quote, "I believe that the ordinary objects and small private rituals of daily life, sometimes poignant, sometimes so commonplace as to be overlooked, are sacred and elegant. I began my career in the arts as a studio furniture maker in 1976. My furniture and sculpture have been exhibited at the Smithsonian Craft Fair, the Philadelphia Museum of Art Craft Fair, Funeraria in San Francisco, and the John Elder Gallery in New York. In 1993, I began painting and studying with Elizabeth Lentz, Jacob Cooley, and Beverly McKeever. I had my first studio show of paintings in 2001, the Hager Smith Design Gallery in Raleigh, and since then, I've had solo shows every year. And I regularly participate in juried and invitational group shows. My work has been featured in arts magazines and on book covers. My awards include painting fellowships at the Virginia Center for Creative Arts and Vermont Studio Center." End quote. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Roger Atkins, Jim Oleson, and Anthony Ulinski. So the first question that I'll begin with is, how did you start working with wood? And was there anyone in particular that taught you? So Roger, you talked about that in your artist statement, so that might be the easiest way to begin. So yeah, how did you start working with wood, and who was your first teacher?
That's a good segue. I just started playing around with it when I was a kid because it was, I liked it. What can I say? And it was in wood shop in junior high school that I started actually making things. And then it was a matter of scraping together whatever materials I could. And I would take my father's hand tools, basically a drill, maybe a saw, and just build some rudimentary sort of structure when I was a kid. And just kept working at it and kept working at it. Then, as far as instructors go, I had an excellent sculpture instructor at UNCC, a guy named John Wofford. Unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago now, about a year and a half. But he taught me a lot about form. And he turned me on to a fellow named Wendell Castle. And and I started just like drooling then. I was like, man, this guy is really good, right? And so the whole stack laminating process is something that once I saw Wendell Castle's work and heard him speak in 1976, I think it was, that was really a pivotal point for me in my sculpture and my furniture making. And I'm still stack laminating today. All three of the pieces in the show are stack laminated. So yeah, that'd be about it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And that's wonderful, that stack lamination. Thank you for giving a term for that. I was just been admiring your work since it's been in the gallery. So it's nice to knowing there's a particular technique. Now, Jim, the same question to you. I saw you kind of nodding and smiling along with Roger's answer there.
Well, I think when I was about 5 years old, I had two uncles, maternal uncles, that were interested in woodworking and had shops. And when I was 5, my Uncle Lewis gave me a little tool chest that he had made for me. Looks like a fishing tackle box. And I think it contained a screwdriver, a plier, and a hammer. And that was kind of the beginning, although I didn't get into studio furniture making until sometime later. I did take art courses when I was in high school and got my driver's license. I was able to drive to a junior college nearby, and I took painting, drawing, watercolor, and I was really interested in being an artist, but I was also conflicted because I was very interested in physics. So from my bio, you can indicate the path taken. But I was finally able to get back into furniture making, making things for our home, and enjoying that. And as time went on, I took a number of workshops. I've been to several of the schools, Anderson Ranch and Mark Adams' place, Haystack. And that's been helpful. I've learned specific techniques. When Roger was talking about stack laminating, yes, I was amused because Wendell Castle had incredible genius, I think, and inventiveness, creativeness. And I did a lot of stack laminating too. It's a way to get three-dimensional forms that would just be almost impossible by other means. So that's my story.
And Anthony?
So I came to it a slightly different way. I was an economics major and was in the 70s, early 70s, and we were reading Small is Beautiful and Buddhist economics and that kind of thing. I had grown up in India and seen Gandhian approach to development with the spinning wheel and the cottage industries. And so I was intrigued by that. I wondered how that would look in this country. And so I moved to North Carolina for what I thought would be a 3-year period, and thought, well, there's a nice little discrete period of time. I can start a woodworking business and see how it looks in this country. And I had never really made anything. But in Econ 101, they used woodworking as an example of a small, easy entry, easy exit business with low externalities, which made it a great economic study or a model for study. And then, so I started a woodworking business, but I knew nothing about it. And so for the first 10 years of my business, I hired people who could show me how to build what I told my clients we were going to make. And my idea was to do a custom furniture business, to sort of insinuate myself into the community as best I could to provide a service. And So initially we were, I was taking anything I could get, windows, gates. Uh, I started to go to auctions and buy broken furniture that needed some minor restoration. And through that process, I learned how furniture is assembled. And over the years, I switched that role around, and now I became the teacher and had apprentices that worked with me. And 45 years later, here I am. So.
That's fascinating that you came to it as a economics study. That's you definitely have the most original path, I have to say, out of everybody I've talked to so far. So the next question I have is teaching woodworking important to you? And if so, why? And so Anthony, you said that now you've gone from being the student to the teacher. So could you kind of talk about teaching in your process?
Yeah, so I actually worked as a mechanic for a few years in San Francisco, and I worked with a master mechanic and his assistant who was also a master mechanic. So I was learning from people who were very, very smart about the craft. And so when I had a role model for my career later on, I didn't, if you think you're going to learn about woodworking in 3 years, well, that's you're mistaken. And you would learn about as much as you do about cars. You'd know how to clean parts, and I was good at that. But so I hired craftspeople who weren't necessarily good teachers, but by working next to them and holding their hammer and handing them things, I was able to learn from them as much as they could. Some were better than others, and some were very impatient, and some were generous as could be. And the craft community I found to be incredibly generous just everywhere. And so if the people I was working with didn't have a response, somebody in the neighborhood did. And there were probably 8 or 9 small micro businesses doing woodworking in my neighborhood in downtown Raleigh. And so you didn't have to go far to find the expertise that you needed. And so then as I got in a position of doing my own work with my own ideas, and I was able to hire people. North Carolina State University has a design school here, and so there was always a constant flow of undergraduates available for part-time work, and some of them stayed on for years and years after graduating, and some moved on to graduate work, and some are heading programs across the nation now. So it was a very rewarding process for me to be a teacher, and I do still do some teaching at workshops and things like that. Less and less now, but every now and then I will get offered a position or apply for a class to teach and get accepted. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting process, and it's nice that you found a way to kind of give back too, and to trying to share that education, and then also being around a lot of people who aren't good teachers, it helps you become a better one.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So Jim, you alluded that you kind of came to woodworking later in life after your time as a physicist and a physician. So is teaching woodworking part of your process at all, or are you kind of spend more time as a student?
Well, I've always been a teacher, but unfortunately not in regard to woodworking. I have 3 children, and as they were growing up, I offered to work with them on projects in my shop. And even though they've turned out to have good skills, they weren't particularly interested in being with me in my shop. And my youngest, my son, Mike, went to college, and after graduation, he announced he wanted to go to graduate school and get an MFA in studio furniture making, and he went through Wendy Maruyama's program, which I found fascinating because, again, there hadn't been much apparent interest on their part as they were growing up. But So I wish I had had opportunities to teach woodworking, but alas, I did not.
Mhm. All right, and Roger, do you teach woodworking at all, or is it important to your process?
You know, I've taught in the shop, you know, as people would come in to work, you know, bring in an apprentice, you know, and teach someone. And I enjoy teaching. But when I think about it, it's interesting because I have never really felt qualified to teach. And I say that because I feel like I'm still in the middle of my learning curve. You know, I mean, I have a feeling it's always going to be that way. Uh, I feel like I'm always in a state of experimentation, especially with my sculptures. And and the idea of trying to teach someone that I interestingly enough don't feel qualified. In my cabinet business and furniture making business, there are certainly techniques that can be taught, and I have taught a few of those. The short answer to your question is that teaching is not a large part of how I do my work. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting, you know, all three of y'all's different answers to that. So next question. So this is kind of fun since all three of you all have experience in working in both furniture and in sculptural work. Would you consider your work more functional or sculptural, or do you like to work in a combination of the two? So Roger, we'll start with you since we ended with you last.
Okay. That's a really interesting question. The piece that I can see over your right shoulder, that piece On Time, was really the first sculptural piece that I've done that I thought I want to make a piece of sculpture that looks like a piece of furniture. Whereas in the past, I've made furniture that looked like sculpture. So the furnishings obviously have a functional element. And really how I make my living is making cabinets and installing them for people, making furniture and installing it. And so they need to function. But when I get down to the play of making my sculptural work, I love to toy around with that fine line. Like in that particular piece, On Time, the idea is a piece of furniture. It functions as a sort of globe, if you will, but that would be a long explanation. But it's a fantasy piece of furniture, I would say. So it approaches the line of furniture, but it's still sculpture. And its appearance would be one of, what are you supposed to do with this? You know, I had it in one show, an outdoor show, and kids just love to get inside of it and sit in it because it's almost like a throne, you know? So yeah, I like the way sculpture and furniture talk to one another. And I try to walk that line on either side of it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And that, I like how you put that, how sculpture and furniture talk to each other. And that has been, the On Time piece has been the one that's gotten the most comments about, is that a chair? What is that? You know, and I could see how it would kind of be. It is very throne-like. Now, Jim, so the same question for you. And the two pieces that we have in our show, one seems to be purely sculptural and the other one is has a mirror on it too. So could you kind of talk about your work? When do you consider it to be more functional or sculptural, or do you like to play in the two?
Well, I started when I was making a lot of custom furniture for people. It was functional, and as time went on, I think I'd have to say that it became minimally functional. And I just was having fun with the design process, and again, moving more and more, I think, toward a sculptural vision rather than a functional furniture vision. And recently my living circumstances changed. I had to downsize, really did not have a shop or studio large enough to accommodate making furniture pieces. And by that point, fortuitously, I'd already decided that I should just go ahead and do sculpture, because that's where I was trending. So of the two objects I have in the show, the mirror with sculpture is a transition piece. It's functional in that it has a mirror and a shelf. But I was thinking also sculptural, sort of sun and moon. So now what I'm making is without any function at all.
Yeah, and the piece that's just over my left shoulder, the Antipodes, is just beautiful in how you have different types of wood there, but you really kind of made them look like they're one piece.
Right. I've done a series. These are really, I would call them two-dimensional objects as opposed to full 3D objects. And part of it was that I was on the learning curve for doing sculpture. But they're kind of fun to make.
And then Anthony, so your pieces that are in the show are also it's kind of a blend between the two of sculpture and function. So could you kind of talk about your work? And
Yeah, so for me, I started as a custom furniture maker. And so initially I was, focused mostly on utility, how the piece is going to be used. I did try and, make it, the designs a little bit unusual or in some way, authentic to me or to my design, although I'm not entirely sure that was ever successful, but certainly not in the first 20 years. But as my skills increased, I tried to push that artistic sculptural element and to the and let some of the utilities slide away. But I think everything I've ever made really is is marginally useful. There's some tiny little drawer or shelf or mirror that could be considered utility, but in the reliquary, those that you have, the drawers are very small, and so the objects are really just for the detritus of our life, the ticket stubs and memorabilia that really so not big objects certainly, but and then the more recently I've been doing a lot of funerary urns, which so you need a couple of 100 cubic feet of interior space for the ashes themselves, but beyond that it can be quite expressive. And working with clients to design and build a funerary urn that sort of talks to the family or friends about the deceased, that's given me a lot of opportunity for sculpture. And there are several there are mantle urns and urns that will be on display for 3 or 4 hours during a service and then interred somewhere. And so I use a variety of different materials for that, using paper and more recyclable things that that look very nice and are sculptural, but actually do contain ashes. And but yes, I try and push the sculptural aspects as much as I can. But I was always a custom furniture kind of utility-based designer. So I think that's still true.
Now, in contrast to Jim and Roger's work that's in here, their work is more kind of looking at the natural grain of the wood, or maybe there's a stain on it. Your pieces are painted. So could you talk a little bit about how you went about designing them, and what your kind of, well, yeah. One, like I love the paint colors that you chose. They're kind of like the muted nature to them. And so then also just what they also kind of have a very peculiar shape to them. So where that kind of comes from.
So the reliquaries were really designed as, in my early urn making, what I wanted to do was to include some of the detritus of someone's life in with the ashes. So all those things that the grieving have no idea what to do with, the old passports, the ticket stubs, the keys, all these things, photographs of people that no one knows who they are, but somehow were maintained in this, deceased collection. incorporating as much of those kinds of things into the urn became sort of an idea for me. And so I had been doing, you know, the soul of the tree, the beauty of the tree and the wood for, you know, many years. And then when I added painting to my world, I started thinking about color. And the reliquaries are primarily built with shop junk. The pieces of wood that, you know, there's no two pieces of wood that are, you know, alike in that. And so their unifying factor is the paint on top. And, but I am very cheap and I hate throwing anything out. And so, you know, you end up with all of these very, you know, odd pieces of wood. And how can I use those? Well, you know, that's, you could rip those down and make drawer sides out of them. Or if they're long and skinny, maybe you can plane them down and, you know, make them part of a bent lamination for the side of the cabinet. But they are really designed, I never used a, you know, a full-size plank of wood for any part of that, except, that's not true, except for the doors. Those are carved out of a single, either poplar or basswood. And in that, you really didn't want any telescoping to happen at a joint over time. There is a possibility of using that joint in the design, because I think most of the wood glues that I use in time do some kind of weird thing where they kind of ooze out, and there's the line, the joint itself, although maybe not visually evident, is you can feel it. And there's a break there, and maybe I never did it right, but so I used solid pieces for the doors, and most of the reliquaries that are not any wider than 24 inches. So in most situations, I was able to get by without having to laminate those. But the rest of it really is done from, you know, the shop detritus, and that I try and use in some reasonable way. And so there have been some that were done in natural woods, but I think I did about 20, maybe 20 of those reliquaries over the course of the last 25 years. And at least one was done in natural wood, but most of it was painted because of the discrepancies between the types of wood. So it was really just following the form. Or
oh wow,
yeah,
that's great. I mean, and it looks like it's all one piece, like it's meant to be put together like that.
Yeah.
So that's very cool. And for me, when I saw, there was one that has the bird on the front, that's very nice. But there's another one that has kind of more just geometric designs on the front. And that one, to me, I was originally immediately just thought about African masks, and if I was wondering if that was anything to do with.
So my childhood was spent overseas. My father was in the development business for the U.S. government. And so we spent a lot of time overseas. And so I did have a lot of international influences on that. And so that shape of the reliquary, it has, you know, it looks like a Zulu shield. The bird actually is from the subcontinent of India. That's a bulbul, a yellow-throated bulbul. I lived there for a couple of years in the early 60s. And that piece was actually designed and built for my mother, and who was a birder, and who taught us all birding as well. So that piece was done with, I used an acrylic paint, which is a little bit brighter. The other geometric form was, that piece was designed as I went. So I would paint and carve and paint and carve and paint and carve, and I ended up with that. And I used a milk paint, which gives that nice sort of pastel, soft look, and it burnishes up beautifully. It's just a beautiful material, and I think it's incredibly strong. I don't think you can get that stuff off unless you just sand it. So very, very durable kind of surface, and yeah.
No, that's very cool. It gets a nice matte finish to it.
Yeah.
You know, I'd never really seen that much milk paint before until this exhibit. We have many artists here that really use a lot of milk paint. I wonder if it's just because it just bonds to wood really well or something. But.
Bonds to wood, and it's not nearly as, there's not the solvents that many wood finishes, you know, like I used a lot of lacquer and varnishes, and really have become so hypersensitive to those kinds of solvents that I'm sure there are some creepy chemicals in the milk paint as well. Pretty colors come from dangerous chemicals typically. And but the solvents are significantly, and it's all water-based, so it's easy to clean up. And so.
Yeah, I have heard that there are lots of volatile organic compounds in a lot of the different finishes and stains that you use with wood. Okay, so the next question I have is, North Carolina has a rich history of furniture making. So is this a factor in your decision to work in the state? And how has your time in North Carolina shaped your work?
I'll take it. I moved to North Carolina. I followed a girl, and she was studying at North Carolina State. And so I had no idea that North Carolina had a furniture background. I did, you know, it certainly made shopping for wood a lot easier. You had suppliers everywhere. You had all kinds of tooling. For the most part, the tooling that North Carolina manufacturers use has nothing to do with what I have in my studio. My tools are very rudimentary: table saw, bandsaw, joiner, planer, that kind of thing. Not any specific tooling for that. So while it is, I did marry a girl from Lexington, which is a furniture capital of, they would say, of North Carolina, and or it was, and I think that might have factored into her coming by the studio, but by and large, it was accidental for me.
Yeah, I would say very similar for me as well. I just happened to be in North Carolina. And this is where I was brought up, and this is where I set up my business, and this is where I started making furniture. One advantage it did have, when I think back, especially when I had a relatively large woodworking business in Charlotte for many years. And I got a good bit of work up and down the East Coast because it was like, oh, we'll get our work from a North Carolina woodworker, because North Carolina woodworkers are the best, right? Well, heck, I could have been in any state, but so I wouldn't say that North Carolina itself lent itself to me starting my business. Now, having said that, being here in Western North Carolina, being up in the mountains around Boone, I discovered as soon as I set my shop up here that I could put a pin down where I am and run a string out three miles and cut a radius around my shop, and there are probably 10, 15 different guys that have got all sorts of lumber stacked up in their barns, in their garage, in their basement. There's so much wood around here that it's amazing. So there's certainly that, which has been quite wonderful for me. It's almost like I'm discovering now at this point in my career the pure joy of being a North Carolina woodworker, because I'm just right in the heart of some fine material. So thanks.
So my coming to North Carolina was related to my medical career, not woodworking. But once here, I discovered that North Carolina has such a rich tradition of crafts and furniture making, that is studio furniture making in addition to the commercial. And so the whole time that we've lived here, I've enjoyed going to galleries and studios. It's very stimulating, very exciting. Many, many years ago, there was a tour of artist studios offered in the Penland area. And I think that may have been offered through UNC. I'm not sure. In any event, my wife and I went on that, and it was so wonderful to get into the artists' studios. Not all were related to furniture, but some were. And again, I just found that terrific. And I've continued to enjoy that about the state.
This next question I have, I'd like to start with you, Jim. So when do you choose to follow traditions, and when do you choose to experiment? And have you managed to kind of make any traditional practices your own?
Well, I think most of what I've made, I've designed, and it's not following a particular tradition. I guess I would call it contemporary furniture. The one exception is that I really like the craftsman style. And I have done pieces in that style, coffee tables and a mantle and surround. But otherwise, I find it more of a challenge to kind of go my own way and try to develop something out of the tradition.
Now, I just wonder, how much does your training as a physicist play into woodworking at all, if at all, for you?
I think it does figure in that I enjoy sometimes the mathematical aspects. Basically, I'm a problem solver. And so when I think about a wood project, I like to think through it step by step before I even start, so that I won't encounter any surprises. I've got all the steps laid out. And I think comes partly out of my physics training. There's a lot of measurement, attention to detail and precision involved in woodworking. So that also kind of relates to my physics background. And in physics, I was doing a lot of what I would call engineering as well, design work. And that has played a part in what I bring to the woodworking.
And then just your piece Antipodes is just amazing to me, because you managed to get those two arches where they get so close and it looks like they're about to touch, but they don't. And it still is structurally sound there, and it looks pretty strong. So is that a hand-carved piece, or how did you achieve that?
It involved both machines and some handwork. And that piece, my focus in that piece was really exactly what you described, the two points almost touching, because I think that creates a tension. And I think of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where God is reaching out with his finger almost touching the finger of Adam. That's a really dramatic tension, that image. I was trying to capture some of that feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a lot of tension in that piece, definitely. Now, Roger, so you also have pieces here that almost touch, like on time, or maybe they're resting in each other, like form and seduction. But how do you choose to follow traditions? I mean, you have a background in furniture making and cabinetry. So do you choose to follow kind of any of those traditions in your building, or do you have you made practices like stack laminating kind of your own process now?
You know, the traditions to me really, they speak more of, they speak mostly about what has survived the test of time. And there are so many wrong ways to work in wood. There are so many wrong ways to put things together, you know, and wood, by its own property, its expansion and contraction, constantly changing with humidity factors, it's alive from the time it springs out of the ground until whenever, you know. I mean, after it's been milled, it's in my furniture, it's still alive, it's still moving. And if I don't use tried and true construction techniques, my pieces are going to literally disassemble themselves with time. They're going to crack and fall apart. So to me, traditions that I follow are not necessarily those that speak of a particular style or type of furniture, as much as a technique that I know will stand up to the test of time. I appreciated what Anthony said too about taking apart old pieces of furniture and looking at how they were put together. you know, because that's a great learning process. That to me is looking at a tradition and how that tradition was constructed to stand the test of time. So, and then as far as taking anything and making it my own, yeah, I certainly, you know, picked up on Wendell Castle's stack laminating process, and other artists have used the stack laminating process, and I'm still riding that horse and really, really enjoy it. Now, is it my own? Far from it. A lot of people use that process. I just have a particular approach to it that may be unique. Maybe not, you know, but again, traditions to me are really about trying to make sure that what I make will hold up to the test of time.
Anthony, how about you for this
So
question?
as a custom furniture maker, my clients would also often come to me and say that they wanted a piece of modern furniture or contemporary furniture, or say use some words from the lexicon of furniture design, but often that had nothing to do with what they were asking for. So they would say modern, I would be thinking Danish modern from the 50s, and they would be thinking something quite different. So while the dialogue often started with a thought of following some traditional form, I was never a traditional furniture maker either. So I modified whatever they said, ran it through my filters, and it came out sort of, you know, I don't want to say bastardization, but that might be the right word, of a more traditional form. But again, I'm with Roger on the joinery. I focused on good finishes and good joinery. I really had no interest in ever repairing my own work. As a mechanic, I knew that when you had a comeback, you had to do more work and you lost the client. So I was determined in my woodworking that I would never under-engineer a piece, and and so far, except for some hinges and drawer slides, I'm okay. The joinery has held up. So not really in any like Chippendale, you know, Sheraton, those kinds of traditions, but the tradition of joinery and finishes and understanding those kinds of things, I think I am deeply ensconced in traditional ways.
Wood has historically been associated with men, and in other mediums that we've explored at the museum, it seems that there definitely are some issues of diversity in gender, race, and age that seem to be a recurring topic in art. Now, do you see similar artists face similar issues facing wood artists?
You know, when I read this question, I was reminded of, and I actually, prior to reading this question, just in the last week or so, I was speaking with someone about the problem of systemic racism in our country. And I hadn't even gone to the gender part of the question because I started thinking about when I first started my business in Charlotte. I had a shop set up on West Moorhead Street, in the shadow of what is now the football stadium. The shop no longer stands, needless to say. But when I was running that business, there was an African-American man, same age as me, had this, you know, basically the same talent. He was a good woodworker for his age, as I was as well. And we were both starting our businesses at the same time. His shop was maybe a half mile further down the street. Him being an African-American man, he could not get work. He couldn't get work. I had plenty of work coming in. I would try to steer as much his way as I possibly could. And that spoke to me directly to the problem of systemic racism in our country. And then as well in the woodworking industry, I think that, you know, in woodworking, we pretty much have the image of the guy in the flannel shirt and, you know, wearing the safety glasses and, you know, going to woodworking shows. And he's usually a white guy, and he's usually in his 40s or something like that. I don't know if that's changing, to be perfectly honest with you, but it was certainly prevalent at the time when I was starting my business. Thanks.
don't think I have particular expertise to address this question, but I can relate that when I was in junior high, I was able to take shop class for 2 years, and the females in the class would take home ec. So there was this divide. I mean, it was just not traditional for women to be doing things like furniture making. But I think that is something that has changed a lot. And my understanding is that Wendy Maruyama was one of the first women in this country to really, let's say, popularize woodworking in terms of something that women could do. And I think through her own educational efforts, it's now commonplace for women to be involved in studio furniture making and other related kinds of woodworking. So I think that's great.
For me, I think it is still predominantly male activity and predominantly white activity. But there are, and have been, even before Wendy, there was Roseanne Somerson and Judy Kensley McKee. And so there have been throughout my career in woodworking, very strong women design builders who have been either out on their own building, Christina Madsen comes to mind, or in academia, like Roseanne and Wendy and many others. So I see more and more of that. It's not quite as unusual, but I have, I think the last time I was at Penland, there was only one woman in the workshop. And that's been 15 years now. I'm sure the ratio is different, but I'm not entirely sure how to describe that or why that might be, but that tradition seems to be intact. But there are, like as you say, Jim says about Wendy at San Diego State, and you know, she has encouraged the next round of female woodworkers, and Kimberly, I forgot her last name, but she's at Middle Tennessee, and she was a protege of Wendy's, and she's heading up their program now. And so I have no doubt that we will see more and more women in. There's no reason for them not to. It's a heavier material than some, but certainly no heavier than that block of clay that gets delivered. And so I don't think that the physical limitations are an impediment at all.
And chance to do some apprenticeship. So then transitioning from our social question to looking more at the natural world. So for y'all, I mean, obviously, you know, nature is important into your work, because without nature, you could not have medium to work with through your wood. But do you find influence from nature in subject matter? Or do you ever use found materials? And how do you choose what materials you work with?
I guess for me, I do use found materials. I have been a scavenger and a guy with a warehouse and a truck. This is not a good combo if you're a pack rat. And so if I saw a dumpster in front of a construction site, I would peer in and try and figure out how to get those beams out of there. And someday somebody else can have those beams, because they're by and large still in my wood shop. And but every now and then I had a client, the Triangle Land Conservancy, and they wanted a boardroom table, and somehow the idea of cutting down trees for a land conservancy didn't make much sense to me. So I used the floor joists from an old warehouse as the planking, and the beams from that same warehouse for the superstructure of the table. And you know, it was not a very highly polished piece. I took the beams to the car wash and power washed them clean, and then burnt, put some 220 to them and polished the top out, which meant there were huge divots and cracks and things like that, which I didn't either hide or disguise or fill or anything. So yes, I do that. But do I use the natural form? Not really. I like the material, and I certainly do pay attention to the qualities and that individual pieces have. But I know that elm is very, very difficult to break, and so for chair parts, I might want to consider that. Other woods have different characteristics, and so I am paying attention to those. I certainly don't want to be carving, Bubinga. Well, I have actually, and I certainly don't want to do it again. But if somebody has a design and it can be done in basswood, that's a great wood for carving. It doesn't allow for a real tight detail. Maple would be better for that. But so I worked with Christina Madsen. I mentioned her earlier, and she was teaching with Makiti Koto, a Fijian wood carver at Haystack. And so there we're using natural woods and laying, veneers over lighter woods or contrasting woods and carving down through. So in those situations, yes, I am paying attention to the wood and the color really of the wood, but not really the form that a tree takes necessarily.
I think about the organic aspects of the shapes I tried to achieve and the math applied to it. I certainly think about organic form a lot when I'm doing pieces, and the newer pieces, which are not on exhibit, but the newer things I'm working on now have a much more organic feel to them. And then as far as using found materials, I very rarely use found materials. I will certainly, and you mentioned this as well, Anthony, about stuff laying around your shop, so to speak. I recently did it was a really nice white oak stair project for a client. And it was 3 flights of stairs. They were thick white oak treads. I bought a lot of white oak and had drops left over, a few boards left over. And it was really enough to make 2 sculptures out of that particular wood. And I fell in love with it. So as a result of working with a material that I don't normally sculpt, I got some color out of it that was just stunningly beautiful to me. Discovery can be made by working from those drops. But organic form, 100%, always been really inspired by it. And the math of organic structure, is amazing to me. Fibonacci numbers blow my mind, and it's what everything's made of. But thanks, that's what I got.
So Willard, I interpreted your question to be, did I use motifs taken from nature? And many artists do. I don't think that I do that, but nature abhors a straight line. And so I figure that the use of curves is really organic, as Roger says. And that's what I take from nature is all the curves. And it was interesting. My early furniture pieces were rectilinear, and then I started to introduce a curve. And what happened is that the curve started to dictate the overall design. It was just, you couldn't put a curve here and not put some curves elsewhere. So it's really interesting how curves take over, and I had to learn how to design with curves to incorporate them and end up with an overall aesthetically pleasing form.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't use found objects either.
Yeah, it seems that all 3 of y'all, you use the material to design something in mind, you don't necessarily design based off the material that you have. Do you ever just?
Yeah, I think that's right for me. There are some occasions where the grain pattern of a board will dictate its placement on in a piece, incorporating a curve into a leg. But for me, really, it's that's less of an issue. More, I mean, it's a beautiful thing when it does happen, and it does look intentional, and it was intentional, but if I hadn't had that board, it wouldn't have been there. So yeah.
I can even go back and reference talking about using the drops of white oak from the stair project. Those drops and the lengths of those drops totally dictated the size of the two sculptures that resulted from them. So one of the things that we talked about when I was in studying art was working within certain confines. That we're not working in a void. There's something generally speaking dictates the beginning of a project. Be it the demands of the client or the idea that has to form from materials on hand in this particular instance. But it's interesting when I think about the fact that these two most recent pieces are absolutely based on the length of the material that I had available to work with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny how that inspiration can strike, and it might be just from the way something looks. Now, we're just, rounding the corner here, but before I go into my last question, really, while we're talking on the curves and everything, Roger, you just really, and curves, that seems to be like your jam. So the on time piece has a very interesting kind of edge that follows and just goes almost like a sine wave up and around the ring on this piece. Now, how do you make those decisions on where your curve goes? Like the arch that's over here, that one, I feel like it was inspired by nature, by the Arches National Park. Was that true, or you just? Well,
no, the arc piece, there were two pieces in the Converging Arcs series. And basically they were based on a 180-degree arc along with a 180-degree spiral. So I wanted to start on one side with a line and end up on the other side with a line. And both of those pieces are like that. And the mathematics behind that of taking each piece, cutting it more or less to shape before the lamination, and then rotating it in a jig to run through the planer to get the angle that I needed. So that rotation happened very specifically to be able to stack this thing together and create an arc with a 180-degree turn to it. Now that's a case of having an idea and finding the math to make that idea work, okay? Then when you go to the on time piece, that is more of a sine wave. And that was where I was trying to do something that wasn't quite as predictable as an arc that goes, or a line that just goes 180 degrees around the piece. And that was just hand drawn. I mean, basically, I started out with the drawing on the wall of the full length of the piece if it were just straightened out. And I drew the sine wave, I figured my laminations and determined where that sine wave would be, or that part of the wave would be on each lamination. So there's a lot of planning going on there. This is another case where that piece was totally planned out before I started figuring out the math behind doing it.
And I appreciated exploring your website because you had some process photos of your work. Now, it just blew my mind when I saw that you came from these like very just rough edges and these pieces that were stacked together. And then you came up with something that's just so smooth that it looks like it had always been there like that. Now, the little squares that are in it that are those just accent pieces, or do those serve a utility?
There's no utility, but they do serve a function in the concept of the piece. Okay, and this is it'll be brief. This piece it came from me trying to get my head wrapped around time relativity and how two objects could start in the same spot, end up in the same spot after a period of two different lengths of time. Okay, and but they arrive at the same time. So I started really thinking about that a lot. The squares on the inside basically are one time segment. The squares on the outside are another time segment. And the sine wave all the way around is another time segment. All of them go around the circle, either inside or outside. They arrive at the end at the same time, but it took them all different lengths of time to get there. So that's the basis of that particular piece. And that's what the squares are about.
Now, the other pieces have those squares in them as well. So are those to also kind of just convey a meaning, or do they don't hold the like rings together at all, or they?
No, the on time piece is the first one that I did where the little squares actually had a significance to the meaning of the piece. And the others, they're purely aesthetic. You know, they're purely there because I like the way they look.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and they add a nice accent, really cool contrast too. Now, with the stacking, it seems like, especially on the arc, it's a very intentional just with the grains, how many of them kind of either to link up in almost like a parabola. Now, is that intentional, like when you're stacking each piece to try to make that the grain lines up like that, or did it just kind of happen like that?
That's luck. That's all that was, you know.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Well, is that really right though? I mean, because you are using it's not a quarter sawn piece of wood, so you know you're going to get a different kind of pattern than with a plain slice. And so, I mean, so yes, luck, but you overlooked other pieces that you could have used that wouldn't have given you that, right?
That is true.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The arc piece too, there's an interesting point to be made about both of the arc piece, both the on time, the circular piece, and the arc piece. They're both hollow, right? Now, as a result, the pieces that are cut out of the middle can be applied later on in the arc. The converging arcs pieces, that particular one, 1/3 the way up, you can start using the cutout from the bottom for the next piece. So if you look at that piece and you go 1/3 the way up, you will see the same grain pattern from the bottom on that next piece, and the same grain pattern from the second one on that next piece, all the way up to another third point, and you'll see it repeat itself again. So there is a pattern that repeats itself in that piece, and that was absolutely unintentional. It's just the way the pieces cut out and got added to it. When it was all said and done and I looked at it, I said, well, that's a trip. You know, this thing repeats itself.
Very cool. So just the last question I have. So Roger, what's your favorite wood to work with?
You know, in furniture, I love working with cherry. I love cherry. I love the way it smells. I love the integrity of the material. I love the way it finishes. And I think using cherry along with a really nice curly maple or bird's eye maple makes for, I think, just stunning contrast and beauty. In my sculpture work, mahogany has been a favorite for many years, primarily because I like the way it works for grinding and shaping. It's not too hard. Now, having said that, I've just started this series in white oak because of those drops, and now I'm going to have to buy some white oak to continue the series. But it's a little more tedious to work with, a little harder, but still comes out very nice and finishes up. So I'm not really answering your question. I like a lot of different woods, and it comes down to the situation that I'm confronted with. And again, and I can go back to what Anthony said about what's in the shop. That dictates a lot of time what I'm going to use. Actually, On Time being the last piece I did in mahogany, that was a matter of going over to a place where this guy sold construction materials, and he said, "Hey, I've got a pallet of Honduras mahogany here." He said that I've had for like 5 years, and it was a construction place. It wasn't a place where sculptors or furniture makers were going to go. So, are you interested in it? And I was like, yeah. And he sold it to me for next to nothing. And that was the case of going, okay, it's time to make a piece of sculpture. I've got the wood for it, you know? So it's going to change from piece to piece and what's available.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Jim? Do you have a favorite wood to work with?
Probably not. I've enjoyed using all kinds of wood. I've done veneer work, marquetry, and one has access to probably 100 or more different wood species. And I've enjoyed all these. I may have a slight preference for walnut. I like the grain pattern, the color. I did live in Arizona for many years and was able to get mesquite. And that's, I suppose I could have some shipped now, but mesquite is not readily available in North Carolina. That's a wonderful wood to work with, though. It machines well, has a wonderful aromatic smell when it's machined, and it's very stable. So I wish I had access to mesquite.
Mm-hmm.
I
How
think
about
for
you,
me,
Anthony?
I'm with Roger on my favorite wood really is overall is cherry. It's not outrageously heavy or hard, or it has the U.S. Department of Agriculture has statistics on everything. But one of the things they talk about is how many failures you get if you're drilling a hole or cutting a mortise, or and they're talking about tear out and things like that. And so it really ranks very highly on all of that. It's really a very nice, tight grained wood. And one of the beauties of that wood is that it ages so gracefully and it gets so rich. So it's the kind of piece that your clients always love, and it comes in a little bit light. I rarely would stain wood, encouraging people to use the kind of wood that that was the color that they wanted. So if they wanted a nice brown wood, then I would encourage them to look at walnut. If they wanted a reddish, warm, I would go with cherry. The oaks, of course, have all kinds of variety, and those do. If you have a client that does insist on a particular color, they really are the easiest to manipulate with stains and finishes. So I use a lot of oak, and also it's very cheap, or it was. But cherry's really no doubt my favorite, and I've been over the last 5 or 6 years just trying to use wood from my inventory. All these beautiful planks that I've been saving for I don't know, for now, I guess. And so the first species that I ran out of was cherry. And so now I don't know what. I actually, somebody just gave me 4 boards, and this is how maybe this is part of being in North Carolina, and everybody's got half a dozen boards in the garage, and they don't know where they came from, and they're not going to use them, and do you want them? And sure. So
I was thinking too about the sensuous nature of being a woodworker. We live in a pretty cool world, because we work with a substance that really feels good. I love the way it feels, right? When you're working it, and so much of it, you can almost close your eyes and know when something is ready. And then, of course, the sight, we get the pleasure of seeing the grain. We get to see this come to life, and I'm still amazed after all these years, when I'll look into like a piece of curly maple or something and go, wow, this stuff is amazing. And then the sense of smell. I can't imagine there's any other medium you can work in that you can either be working with something that smells like cat poop, or something that smells like roses, and obviously I can tell you, which one I would prefer to work in, which brings me back to cherry, because I do think cherry is a wonderful scent when you're working it, So I think that's part of the seduction of being a woodworker, just all this, the sensuality of it.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Yeah, well, I appreciate y'all's time and your responses today. They're just very thoughtful.